Today on Better Book Clubs, how I choose the books I read. I've been kind of fascinated lately by the different ways that booktubers use to pick the books that they're going to read. So today I want to talk to you about how I choose the books I read and what I found out when I went back to analyze the different ways in which I found the books that I read. So I ended up going through the books that I've read in the past 2 years. So it's between 50 and 60 books. And I categorized them based on why I read them or where I found them. And what I found was that 5 kind of categories floated up to the surface as the main ways in which I choose or find the books that I'm going to read. The top 2 of them are actually professional, and I count those books because part of my job as a writer for an online magazine called Daily Nutmeg is to interview authors, either as part of our summer reading series or if somebody's written a book during some other time of year that's relevant to Greater New Haven, which is where I work. Those are often really pleasurable reads, and it's definitely fun to read something when you know that you're going to have a chance to interview the author. There's that kind of professional reading, and that actually came in second in terms of the way in which I choose books. But the top category had more to do with my work as an author of my own writing and the books that I read for research, meaning I'm looking for editors and mostly agents who I think might be a good match for me. I had an agent for my first novel, and now I'm looking for a second agent. And so I'm always looking at different books to try and figure out whether the agents who represent them might be a good match for me and my work. So those were the top 2 categories in which I read over the past couple of years. So in the first category, books that I was reading professionally as an author included a book called Census by a writer named Jessie Ball, who I'm going to talk about some more in my end of the year roundup because that book just kind of blew me away. It was really an amazing read. And another one that I read in that same category was a book that I read as research for something I'm writing, and it's titled The Pleasures of Reading in an Age of Distraction by a writer named Alan Jacobs. And that was also a really interesting book that I'll probably talk some more about again sometime. So these were both professional reads, but also reads that I really enjoyed personally. In the second category of books that I've read over the past couple of years, for the purpose of interviewing the author, I'll just throw out a couple of titles and authors that I think what you might be interested in, and then I'll put some others in the comments section below. But one of them is a poetry collection called Felon by a poet named Reginald Dwayne Betts. And keep your eye on him because he is going to be big. In fact, he recently had a piece in the New York Times Magazine, and he is really speaking to a lot of issues that are being talked about today in terms of mass incarceration. So his poetry book, Felon, was a really powerful read and one that I could recommend to anybody who's interested in contemporary poetry. I also read a book called Formation by a writer named Dostie, who happens to live near me and who wrote her memoir about serving in the military and being raped and the repercussions of that horrible experience that she had, but also how badly it was managed and how difficult the aftermath of this situation was for her. So that book did really well when it first came out, but I'm going to give it a little plug again, Formation by Leigh Dostie. So those were all books that I read professionally. And again, those were the top 2 categories in terms of the number of books that I read and why I chose to read them. But coming in third place, really close on the heels of second place, was a group of books that I read for my own personal pleasure that I found in just like browsing in a used bookstore or a new bookstore, and just kind of picked up without having given it any forethought. So impulse buys, that was the next biggest category of how I found the books that I read. So in that category, included in that category is a few books that I picked up at a used bookstore in Niantic, Connecticut called The Book Barn. It's an amazing place. I'll link to it below in case anybody it lives in Connecticut and has an opportunity to go to the Book Barn themselves. It's this big old rambling barn full of books. Maybe I'll go someday and do a video on it. And you can spend hours there just pouring through all the different choices. So I went there a couple of times in the last couple of years and just brought home a whole ton of books, some of which I haven't even gotten to yet, but some of which turned out to be favorites of mine, including the autobiography of Sylvia Beach, who was the owner of the really famous Paris bookstore, Shakespeare and Company. And again, I'm going to talk some more about that in my year-end roundup, so I won't say anything more about it now, except that I found it completely by accident. I also found completely by accident in the Strand bookstore in New York City, another really famous bookstore that just goes on forever, and you know, several floors worth, and again, you could spend a whole day there. But at the Strand, I picked up a book by Lauren Elkin called Flaneuse, and the subtitle is something like Women Walk the City. It's a nonfiction book, partly memoir and partly the biography of a number of different interesting women who were against the social norms out there in the city or out there in the world, walking around and observing. So that was also kind of an interesting read that I just stumbled across completely by accident. Tied then for 4th and 5th place were books that were on my own shelf that I've been meaning to read for a long time. So I alluded to that before, like when I finish one book, I just kind of wander around and find something. Kind of like wandering around the bookstore, only it's wandering around my own shelves where I have books that I've had literally for years that I've never gotten to. I think that's a pretty common experience of readers, judging by what I hear from other people. But one of the books that I read in that category in the past couple of years was A Map of the World by Jane Hamilton. I had always meant to read it, and it's a pretty old book by now. It was published in the 90s, and one of the really interesting things that happened when I read that book was I realized how much more slow and luxurious popular fiction was in the 90s compared to today, when everything has to be like short and snappy and suspenseful, moving you from plot to plot to plot point. And so I really enjoyed reading this book, probably in a way I wouldn't have enjoyed it when it first came out, because it's so different now from what popular fiction reads like. And tied with that category of books was the category of books that were either given to me as gifts or just passed along to me or even just recommended to me by family and friends. In that category of books, this past year, I read a novel called There There by Tommy Orange that a bunch of people had recommended to me, 3 different friends, but at different times. And so it was kind of striking because this book kept coming up again and again. And people will tell you in advertising that you have to have a certain number of impressions before you take action. And I think that was the case with There There. After I had 2 or 3 friends mention it to me, I thought, okay, this is definitely a book I need to read. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about it in my end of year video for 2020. There were a few other categories as well that didn't have as many books in them. One of them was books that I reread in the last couple of years, either for pleasure or because I was going to be teaching them and I needed to refresh my memory. And then there was one book that I ordered to support the author that ended up then sitting on my shelf for a little while before I read it, and it turned out to be a great book. I don't even know why I didn't pick it up right away, except to say that it was maybe mismarketed more as chick lit, and it turned out to be a really savvy, smart, intellectual book. It's a book called Good on Paper by Rachel Cantor, and I would recommend it highly for anybody who likes what you might call literary mystery. And then there was the category of books that I read for a book club. Those were both classics that I read with a book club on Goodreads called Classics in the Western Canon. There were 2 books that were given to me as a gift. They were memoirs written by family members, and I really enjoyed reading those. There were 2 books that I read because they were nominated for prizes, and there were also some impulse choices that came off the library shelf in the audiobooks section. So often when I'm picking out an audiobook to listen to in the car, I'll do the same thing that I do in the bookstore, which is I'll just kind of go wandering into the library and see what's on the shelf and see what kind of strikes my interest at that moment. So that was another category of how I chose books to read in the last couple of years. And then finally, there were 3 books that I chose just because there was a lot of buzz around them. They were new releases and everybody seemed to be talking about them. And it wasn't that they had been personally recommended to me by friends, which I think is probably a better way of getting recommendations from people who actually know what you like to read and what you'll be interested in. But there were 3 books I read because larger marketing campaigns got to me, and so I picked those books. Incidentally, I usually set up a reading challenge for myself to read 30 books a year, and I keep track of it on Goodreads. And I know that doesn't sound like very many books for some people who are really avid readers, but I have a super busy life raising kids and working a couple of jobs, and so over the past 10 years, that was a pretty reasonable number of books for me to read. And I actually have another video if you're interested in learning more about not only that kind of setting goals idea and what I think of that, but also my argument about why reading more books is not better. So that's kind of a wrap up of where the 50 or 60 books I've read in the last couple of years came from, the different sources and the different ways in which I chose what I read. It'll be interesting to see going forward whether those same categories tend to dominate or whether there's any shift in my reading habits over the next couple of years. Do you actually know where your reading choices come from? I'd be really interested to hear more about it in the comments section below. If you like what you see here, please don't forget to subscribe, and I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.